What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors walks onto a late night talk show expecting a friendly conversation, only to be blindsided by a host who crosses every line imaginable? It only took 42 seconds of disrespect before the entire interview exploded into chaos, ending with security being called and cameras cutting to commercial. This is the story of how Jimmy Kimmel destroyed his own show in real time. Samuel L. Jackson arrived at the studio that evening like he had done dozens of times before on countless talk shows. He was there to promote his latest film, to share some laughs, to connect with the audience. The man is a legend. Decades in the industry, hundreds of films, a presence that commands respect wherever he goes. He walked out onto that stage with his signature cool confidence, waving to the cheering crowd, settling into the guest chair with that relaxed energy he always brings. Jimmy Kimmel sat across from him, grinning that familiar grin. The show had just come back from commercial break. The audience was pumped. Everything seemed normal at first, standard late-night television. But something was different in Kimmel's demeanor that night. There was an edge to him, a smugness that was about to reveal itself in the worst possible way. "So Sam," Kimmel started, leaning back in his chair like he owned the world, "I've been watching your movies for years, and I gotta ask, do you ever get tired of playing the same angry guy in every single film?" The audience laughed, but it was that uncomfortable laughter, the kind where people aren't sure if they should be laughing or not. Samuel L. Jackson's expression shifted slightly. His smile stayed, but you could see something change in his eyes. He's a professional, though. He handled it with grace. "Well, Jimmy," Jackson replied smoothly, "I think if you actually watched my films, you'd see I play a pretty wide range of characters. But I appreciate you reducing my entire career to one note." The audience didn't know whether to clap or stay silent. Kimmel laughed, but it wasn't a genuine laugh. It was that dismissive chuckle hosts do when they think they're being clever. "Come on, don't be so sensitive," Kimmel said, waving his hand dismissively. "I'm just saying, you've got that whole tough guy thing down. It's your brand, right? Walk in, say some cool lines, maybe drop a few words that get bleeped, collect your paycheck, move on to the next one." Now, the tension was real. You could feel it through the screen. Samuel L. Jackson sat up a little straighter in his chair. His jaw tightened just slightly. This wasn't playful banter anymore. This was disrespect, plain and simple, and it was happening on live television in front of millions of viewers. "Jimmy, I'm not sure what you're trying to do here," Jackson said, his voice calm but firm. "But if you invited me on your show just to insult my work, maybe you should have told me that before I came. Out here." Kimmel kept going. That's the thing about some hosts. They get so caught up in trying to be funny, trying to create a viral moment, that they forget they're talking to actual human beings who deserve respect. He leaned forward, that smirk still plastered on his face. "Oh, come on, Sam. You're a big boy. You can take a joke, right? Or is that tough guy persona just for the cameras?" The audience was dead silent now. You could hear individual coughs. People were shifting in their seats. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was uncomfortable. This was a host who had completely lost the thread of what his job was supposed to be. Samuel L. Jackson stared at him for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was steel. "A joke is funny, Jimmy. What you're doing right now isn't funny. It's disrespectful. I came here to talk about my film, to have a good time, and you're sitting here trying to tear me down for what? For ratings? For your ego?" Kimmel's face changed then. The smirk faltered. But instead of backing down, instead of apologizing like any decent person would, he doubled down. This is where things went from bad to catastrophic. "You know what your problem is?" Kimmel said, pointing his finger across the desk. "You guys come on these shows. You expect us to just kiss your feet, ask you softball questions, make you look good. Well, sorry if I'm actually trying to do something interesting here instead of another boring press junket interview. The audience gasped. Actual gasps. Samuel L. Jackson stood up from his chair. Not aggressively, but deliberately. He was done. You could see it in his body language. The man had reached his limit, and honestly, who could blame him? He had been nothing but professional, and he was being attacked by someone who was supposed to be his host. Interesting? Jackson said, his voice rising now. You think being rude is interesting? You think insulting your guests is good television? Let me tell you something, Jimmy. I've been doing this longer than you've been on the air. I've sat across from hundreds of hosts, and I've never, not once, been treated with this level of disrespect. Kimmel stood up too now, and that's when you could see he realized he'd made a massive mistake. But his ego wouldn't let him back down. He was committed to this disaster. "Oh, here we go," Kimmel said, throwing his hands up. The Hollywood star throwing a tantrum because someone actually challenged him for once. "You're proving my point right now, Sam." "Challenged me?" Jackson shot back. "You haven't challenged me, Jimmy. You've insulted me. There's a difference. A challenge would be asking me a thoughtful question about my craft, about my choices as an actor, about the themes in my work. What you did was reduce my entire career to a punchline because you thought it would make you look clever." The cameras were still rolling. The producers in the booth were probably losing their minds, trying to figure out whether to cut to commercial or let this play out. The audience was completely silent, watching this unprecedented meltdown happen in real time. Kimmel opened his mouth to respond, but Jackson held up his hand. "No, I'm not done," Jackson said, and the authority in his voice was unmistakable. "You know what the sad part is? I actually used to respect this show. I thought you were one of the good ones, Jimmy. But tonight, you showed me exactly who you are. You're a bully with a microphone and a desk, and you think that gives you the right to talk to people however you want." "I'm a bully?" Kimmel said, his voice getting defensive now. "You're the one standing here yelling at me on my own show." "Your show," Jackson replied. "Your show exists because people like me agree to come on here and help you fill an hour every night. And this is how you repay that? By making us targets for your insecure attempts at edgy comedy." The audience started applauding. Not the polite applause you usually hear on talk shows. Real applause. Support for Jackson. Because everyone watching could see exactly what was happening. They were witnessing a man standing up for himself against someone who had abused his position as host. Kimmel's face was red now. Whether from embarrassment or anger, it was hard to tell. Probably both. "You know what? If you don't like it, you can leave," Kimmel said, and the moment those words left his mouth, you could see him regret it. But it was too late. The words were out there. Samuel L. Jackson smiled. Not a warm smile. A knowing smile. "Oh, I'm leaving," Jackson said calmly. "Trust me, I'm leaving. But before I go, I want everyone watching at home to understand something. When you come on these shows, you're putting yourself out there. You're vulnerable. You're trusting the host to have a conversation with you, not to ambush you. What happened here tonight was an ambush. And it says a lot more about Jimmy Kimmel than it does about me." He started walking toward the stage exit. Kimmel called after him. "Sam, come on. Don't be like this. It was just jokes, man." Jackson stopped and turned around one last time. "Jokes are supposed to be funny, Jimmy. What you did tonight wasn't funny. It was mean. And there's a difference." With that, Samuel L. Jackson walked off the stage. The audience erupted in applause, a standing ovation for a guest who had just walked out mid-interview. Kimmel stood there, alone on his stage, realizing that he had just created one of the biggest disasters in late-night television history. But let's rewind and talk about how we even got to this point. Because this didn't come out of nowhere. There was a context to this confrontation that makes it even more significant. Samuel L. Jackson had been on a press tour for weeks. He'd done interview after interview, always professional, always gracious, always willing to engage with whatever questions came his way. He's known in the industry as one of the good ones. Crew members love working with him. Other actors respect him. Journalists appreciate his thoughtfulness and his willingness to give real answers instead of just promotional sound bites. So when he agreed to do Jimmy Kimmel's show, everyone expected it would be a great segment. Maybe some fun stories from the set, some laughs about his long career, perhaps a game or a bit. Standard late-night fare. Nobody expected what actually happened. The thing is, there had been whispers in the industry about Kimmel's interviewing style becoming more aggressive. Some guests had privately mentioned that he seemed more interested in creating viral moments than actually having conversations. But those were just whispers. Nothing public. Nothing concrete. Until this night. When Jackson walked out onto that stage, he was expecting the Jimmy Kimmel he'd met before. The funny, affable host who seemed genuinely interested in his guests. But something had changed. Maybe Kimmel was having a bad day. Maybe he thought pushing boundaries would make for better television. Maybe his ego had grown too large. Whatever the reason, he came out swinging from the very first question. That opening question about Jackson playing the same angry guy in every film wasn't even accurate. Anyone who's actually familiar with Jackson's work knows the incredible range he's shown throughout his career, from the moral complexity of Jules in Pulp Fiction, to the vulnerability of Abel Turner in Lakeview Terrace, to the quiet dignity of Coleman in The Sunset Limited. The man has depth, serious depth. To reduce all of that to angry guy was not just inaccurate, it was insulting. And Jackson's response was perfect. He didn't blow up. He didn't get defensive. He simply pointed out, with a smile, that if Kimmel had actually watched his films, he'd know better. It was a gentle correction, the kind that gives the host a chance to pivot, to acknowledge the mistake, and move on to better questions. But Kimmel didn't take that exit. Instead, he pushed harder, telling Jackson not to be so sensitive. That's when you could see the dynamic shift. Because telling someone they're being too sensitive when they've just called out your inaccuracy is a classic deflection tactic. It's what people do when they know they're wrong but don't want to admit it. When Kimmel followed up with the comment about Jackson's brand being the tough guy who collects paychecks, that's when the gloves really came off. Because now he wasn't just making an inaccurate observation. He was suggesting that Jackson was some kind of sellout who didn't care about his craft. That's a deep insult to an actor who has consistently chosen interesting, complex roles throughout his career, who has worked with some of the greatest directors in cinema, who has elevated every project he's been part of. Jackson's response, pointing out that if Kimmel had invited him just to insult his work, he should have said so up front, was the voice of reason. It was a clear statement. This isn't banter. This is disrespect, and it needs to stop. Any decent host would have heard that and immediately apologized, blamed it on bad jokes, and moved the conversation in a better direction. But Kimmel kept going. The comment about Jackson being a big boy who should be able to take a joke revealed everything about Kimmel's mindset. He genuinely believed that his position as host gave him license to say whatever he wanted, and that his guests should just sit there and take it with a smile. That's not how respect works. That's not how human interaction works. When Jackson called out the difference between a joke and disrespect, he was speaking truth. Comedy can be edgy, it can push boundaries, but it has to come from a place of understanding and, ultimately, respect for the person you're talking to. What Kimmel was doing was using comedy as a shield for behavior that was simply cruel. The moment when Kimmel accused Jackson of expecting to be asked softball questions and having his feet kissed showed just how disconnected he was from reality. Asking respectful questions isn't the same as asking softball questions. You can ask tough, probing, interesting questions without being insulting. The best interviewers know this. They know how to challenge their guests, how to dig deeper, how to create compelling television without resorting to personal attacks. When Jackson stood up from his chair, the entire energy in that studio shifted. This wasn't a bit. This wasn't planned. This was a real human being reaching his breaking point after being disrespected on national television. And the audience felt it. You could see it in their faces, in their body language. They were with Jackson, not with their host. Jackson's speech about having been in the industry longer than Kimmel had been on the air, about having sat with hundreds of hosts and never being treated with this level of disrespect, that was powerful. Because it was true. Jackson has been a guest on countless shows, from serious news programs to silly late-night comedy shows. And he's always been a good sport. He's played along with bits. He's told funny stories. He's been self-deprecating when appropriate. But he's never been attacked like this. Kimmel's response, calling it a tantrum and suggesting that Jackson was proving his point, was pure deflection. When you're wrong, and you know you're wrong, the easiest thing to do is try to make the other person look unreasonable. But it didn't work. Anyone watching could see who was in the wrong here. When Jackson made the distinction between being challenged and being insulted, he was giving a masterclass in media literacy. A challenge engages with your work, your ideas, your choices. It makes you think. It pushes you to articulate your vision and your process. An insult just tears you down, without substance, without purpose beyond making the insulter feel superior. The line about Kimmel being a bully with a microphone and a desk cut right to the heart of the issue, because that's exactly what he was being. He was using his position of power, the fact that he controlled the show and the audience and the cameras, to attack someone who had come on in good faith. That's the definition of bullying. When Kimmel got defensive and said Jackson was yelling at me on my own show, he revealed his true priorities. It wasn't about having a good conversation or making good television. It was about his ego, his show, his control. The fact that he was mistreating a guest didn't matter to him as much as the fact that someone was calling him out on his own turf. Jackson's response about the show existing because people agree to come on and help fill an hour was another truth bomb. Late night shows need guests. They need celebrities and actors and musicians and authors to come on and be entertaining and promote their projects. Without guests, there is no show. So treating those guests with contempt is not just rude, it's stupid from a business perspective. The audience applause for Jackson during the confrontation was remarkable. Usually, audiences are trained to clap when the applause sign lights up, to laugh when something is supposed to be funny, to stay quiet when the mood is serious. But this applause was organic. It was spontaneous. It was people responding to what they were witnessing and choosing a side. When Kimmel told Jackson he could leave if he didn't like it, that was the final nail in the coffin. Because in that moment, he was essentially admitting that he valued his ego over his guest, over his show, over basic human decency. He was willing to blow up his own interview rather than simply apologize. And Jackson's response was perfect. He didn't storm off in anger. He didn't throw anything or curse or make a scene beyond what had already happened. He simply said he was leaving, explained clearly why he was leaving, and walked off with dignity. That final exchange, where Kimmel tried to play it off as just jokes, and Jackson corrected him one last time about the difference between jokes and meanness, that was the perfect conclusion to the disaster. Because it showed that Jackson understood exactly what had happened. He understood the power dynamics at play, and he wasn't going to let Kimmel rewrite the narrative. The standing ovation as Jackson walked off was unprecedented. In all the years of late-night television, you rarely see an audience side with a guest over the host to that degree. But they did, because what they witnessed was one person being cruel, and another person standing up for themselves with grace and clarity. Standing there alone on stage, Kimmel had to have realized the magnitude of his mistake. He had just humiliated himself on his own show in front of his own audience, with cameras broadcasting everything to millions of viewers. He had let his ego override his judgment, and the result was a complete disaster. What made this confrontation so powerful was how clearly it illustrated the dynamics of power and respect in the entertainment industry. Hosts have an enormous amount of power in the interview setting. They control the questions, the pacing, the tone. They have a home field advantage. Their audience is conditioned to side with them. The guests are on unfamiliar territory, trying to promote their work, trying to be entertaining, trying to navigate whatever the host throws at them. Most guests, when faced with a hostile host, will try to laugh it off, deflect, keep things light, because they know that fighting back can make them look difficult or unprofessional. They know that the host controls the edit, controls the narrative, so they endure the disrespect because the alternative seems worse. But Samuel L. Jackson refused to play that game. He refused to sit there and smile while being insulted. He used his own power, his own credibility, his own standing in the industry to push back against someone who was abusing their position. And in doing so, he showed everyone watching that you don't have to accept disrespect just because someone has a platform. The fact that he did it so calmly, so articulately, without losing his temper or resorting to personal attacks, made it even more powerful. He wasn't being unprofessional. He was being honest. He was setting a boundary and enforcing it. That's not a tantrum. That's self-respect. Throughout the entire confrontation, Jackson never insulted Kimmel personally. He criticized his behavior, his choices as a host, his approach to the interview. But he didn't call him names or attack his character beyond what was directly relevant to what was happening. That restraint, that focus, made his points land even harder. Kimmel, on the other hand, kept making it personal. He questioned Jackson's sensitivity, his professionalism, his willingness to be challenged. He tried to make it about Jackson's ego rather than about his own behavior. That's what people do when they know they're wrong. They try to shift the focus onto the other person's reaction rather than their own action. The thing is, television audiences are smart. They can see through these dynamics. They can tell when someone is being genuine and when someone is being defensive. They can recognize sincerity and they can spot bullying. And in this case, they saw everything clearly. What made Jackson's exit so memorable was the finality of it. He didn't threaten to leave. He didn't give Kimmel chances to apologize or make it right. He simply stated his position, explained his reasoning, and walked away. That decisiveness, that clarity of purpose, resonated with everyone watching. The visual of Kimmel standing alone on that stage, the silence after Jackson left, the awkward applause that followed, it all painted a picture of a host who had completely lost control of his own show, not because of technical difficulties or unexpected circumstances, but because of his own choices, his own behavior, his own inability to treat a guest with basic respect. This moment will be studied in media courses for years to come. It's a perfect example of how not to conduct an interview, how not to use power, how not to interact with someone who has agreed to be on your show. It's also a perfect example of how to stand up for yourself with dignity and clarity. For everyone watching at home, for everyone who has ever been in a situation where someone with power over them treated them poorly, Jackson's response was validating. It showed that you don't have to accept poor treatment. You don't have to smile and nod when someone is being cruel. You can stand up, you can speak your truth, and you can walk away. The aftermath in that studio must have been chaos. The producers scrambling to figure out what to do next. The crew probably shocked at what they'd just witnessed. The audience members talking among themselves about what they'd seen. And Kimmel, standing there, having to somehow continue his show after losing his guest in spectacular fashion. This wasn't a moment that could be edited away or spun into something else. It was live television at its most raw and real. There was no take two, no do-over, no chance to smooth things over in post-production. What happened, happened, and everyone saw it. The broader implications of this moment extend beyond just this one interview. It raises questions about the culture of late-night television, about the relationship between hosts and guests, about what we expect from entertainment, and where we draw the line between edgy comedy and cruelty. For years, there's been a trend toward more aggressive, more confrontational interview styles. Some hosts have built their brands on being tough, on asking the questions others won't ask, on pushing guests out of their comfort zones. And when done well, when done with skill and respect, that can create compelling television. But there's a difference between being tough and being mean. There's a difference between asking uncomfortable questions and insulting someone's life work. There's a difference between creating tension for dramatic effect and genuine disrespect. And Kimmel crossed all those lines. What Samuel L. Jackson did by walking off that stage was draw a line in the sand. He said, "This far and no further." He showed that there are consequences for treating people poorly, even if you're the host, even if it's your show, even if you think you're being funny. The power of that moment lies in its simplicity. It wasn't complicated. It wasn't ambiguous. One person was being disrespectful. Another person called it out and left. Clear, direct, honest. And because of that clarity, it resonated so deeply with so many people. In a media landscape that often feels scripted and managed and carefully controlled, this moment of genuine human interaction, of real emotion and real consequence, stood out. It reminded everyone that behind the celebrity, behind the promotional tours, behind the carefully crafted public personas, these are real people with feelings and dignity that deserve to be respected. Samuel L. Jackson walked off Jimmy Kimmel's show that night, but he walked off with his head held high, with his dignity intact, and with the support of everyone who witnessed what happened. That's the real story here. Not that an interview went wrong, but that someone had the courage to stand up for themselves when it mattered.